Very warm good morning to all of you, and welcome back to the workshop. We have had a very fruitful discussion yesterday where we essentially looked at GCC externally. We talked about how GCC translates your program by looking at various intermediate dumps that is produced by GCC, and then we also saw how we can construct, how we can build a compiler out of GCC. We talked about the difference between native building and building a cross compiler. Today is the day when we are going to get into the internals of the GCC. We're going to open up the hood and we're going to look at all the internal details in almost gory details. So what we intend to do today is to actually look at how GCC works or at the Gimple level. We will also talk about something new in GCC, that's the link time optimization. In today's lecture, it's possible that there may be some terms which might be new to some of you. If that happens, please feel free to ask me. The chances are that I might give a one-line answer, and I may say that let's wait for a while and the meaning of the term will become very clear. So here is an outline. We will talk about why is it that we need to talk about plugin mechanisms in GCC. We'll define what we mean by plugin mechanisms because there are different terminologies that people use. Then we'll look at the control flow. And when we say control flow of GCC, we essentially mean the control flow of CC1, the control flow of a compiler generated out of GCC. And then we'll focus on link time optimization. This is this lecture. In the next lecture, we'll talk about how to manipulate Gimple. And in the final lecture of the day, we will talk about data flow analysis. We won't talk too much about GCC because by the time we have finished Gimple manipulation, things would be fairly clear to you as to how a typical data flow analysis can be implemented in GCC. So let's get into this lecture. So we want to talk about module binding mechanisms in GCC. What do we mean by module binding mechanisms? If we talk about a large software consists of modules, and there's a need for adding modules, there's a need for removing modules, there is a need for maintaining modules relatively independently. If I want to add a functionality to GCC, I would be happy if I have to change only one file. I mean, as we've seen that the whole tarball consists of some 71,000 files. I don't want to be bothered with those 71,000 files. I would rather want to look at a file or a group of files, a small part of the whole compiler. And I should be able to work productively, relatively independently without having to know about the other compiler. The details of the other parts of the compiler, I may have a fair idea, an abstract idea, a top level idea, but I need not have to know all details because of the complex size. So therefore we need a mechanism whereby we can plug in, we can essentially include a new module. Okay, this mechanism is called by many names. Some people call it plugin, some people call it hook, some people call it callback. Sometimes it remains unnamed, and we'll see an example. So in GCC, all these three names get used in three different contexts, although essentially what is being conveyed is same. Okay. If you want to add a module or a plugin, what it involves is you might want to make some changes in the main source code. So you downloaded all the files, and in order to include something in GCC, if you need to compile the whole source, if you need to recompile the whole source, it implies static linking. It implies involving static linking. It's also possible that you might include something in GCC without having to recompile the source, and that involves dynamic linking. We are all familiar with this way of extending the functionality. Particularly, we have this notion of plugins in browsers. So we have a plugin for showing, let's say, PDF files. So we have plugins that start a video player or a music player as soon as you open up a video file. So here we are not recompiling the browsers at all. Here dynamic linking is taking place. GCC supports both the mechanisms. In one case, you use static linking, and in the other case, you use dynamic linking. Okay? We call the first one as a static plugin, and we call the second one as a dynamic plugin. Now, why is it that we choose this name? Okay, we view plugin at a more general level instead of the conventional level. Okay? Normally, when people say plugin, they almost always mean dynamic plugin. In fact, plugins in softwares like Firefox or any other web browser or anywhere else means a dynamic plugin. However, there is no reason why what is plugged in statically with static linking can't be called a plugin. So, in order to be precise about the terminology, we will call everything as a plugin, but there is a nature of how it's plugged in could be different. It could be static or dynamic, because I think that it creates the adjective static and dynamic create a good contrast. Okay. Having talked about a plugin, so let's distinguish between a plugin and a module. Okay. Plugin could be seen as a process of including a module. So I want to separate about module. At the moment, I don't want to talk about the module. I want to talk about the mechanism. And this mechanism is something that has to be cleanly supported by the software. There has to be a mechanism whereby I make some changes or I do some things and I'm able to include a new module. Okay. Most often, a plugin in a C-based software is a data structure. This is the most important part that we have to realize. When we say that we have a plugin, we are allowed to bring in a new module. The way it is done is by supporting a data structure that contains function pointers and perhaps some other auxiliary information. So whenever we want to include a new module, all that we need to do is to make sure we write the code that we want to write, define the entry function of the particular code, and then make sure that the pointer to that function is included in some data structure that GCC already knows. So we are going to look at these plugins. Okay. When we talk about static plugin, a static plugin in particular in GCC requires us to make changes in makefile.in. In fact, anywhere when we have a static plugin, we will have to change makefile. In GCC, at least CC1 may have to be recompiled, and all files that include the changed header file. So if you make a change in a header file, and this header file may have been included in lots of places, all these files will have to be recompiled. Okay. A dynamic plugin, on the other hand, includes a dynamic linking. It's supported on platforms that support the option -LDL dynamic. It's loaded using DLOpen system call and invoked at predetermined location. So we have to write the function and we have to specify where it has to be invoked. We need a certain option for compiling it. The commands are there in the handouts and you can see what the command line options are. So let's look at the need for plugins. So yesterday we observed that GCC is essentially a driver. It's not the main compiler. It's a driver that invokes CC1. It's a driver that invokes assembler, linker, etc. Okay. So we need a plugin in order to include a translator. So GCC is a driver. You can include any translator into it. You can write your own translator and make sure that GCC is able to include it. For example, this was the picture that we had earlier, and later GCC included link time optimization. Now, link time optimization is a new plugin. It's seen as a new translator. GCC driver is able to call it. Okay. So that's one part of the plugin. We need a plugin to include a new translator in the driver without having to change the driver source. We should be able to specify that only in a data structure, and we'll see that data structure shortly. We also need plugins in the generated compiler. So we have parser, gimplifier, pre-SSA optimizer, RTL generator or expander, maybe the code generator, the recognizer, etc., etc. Okay. Here also we would like to include our own pass. We need a plugin to specify a front end, a language front end in CC1, because we are able to support 7 languages. Tomorrow we may want to include another language. So we should be able to say, we should be able to write the parser independently, and we should be able to say, okay, now that I have a new parser, please include it in the main CC1 compiler. So in CC1, we need a plugin for a front end, we need a plugin for adding optimization passes, and we need a plugin to hook up a backend. Because it's a compiler generator, we don't want to generate all of the code. We want to generate only part of the code. And when we generate part of the code, we would like the unchanged code to interact with the generated code in a well-defined manner. How do I ensure? So there is some part of the code that is unchanged and there is some part of the code that is generated. And the part of the code that is generated is based on the specifications. So when I write my unchanged code, I don't even know what will come in the generated code. How do I make sure that this unchanged code, the generic piece of code, is able to interact with the new generated code? So we need to have a mechanism whereby we are able to say, okay, these are the files that are generated. Maybe there are generator programs that are going to generate all these files. So these files are generated, and the software, the module that's supported by these generators is called by the unchanged part of the software in such and such a manner. So that's a plugin mechanism for hooking up a backend. So what kind of plugins we have seen so far? A plugin to bring in a new translator in the GCC driver, a plugin to bring in a new front end in GCC, a plugin to include a new pass, presumably an optimization pass in GCC, and a plugin to include a new backend. These are the things that we expect to keep changing. So we would like the entire software structure to remain unaffected by the changes that are made in these parts. These are all static plugins, at least as of now. We have a dynamic plugin for passes as well, but we will go to the dynamic plugin later. In today's lab, we will do exercises based primarily using dynamic plugin. Until last year, we used to use static plugin. Before last year, dynamic plugin was not even supported by GCC. Static plugin would require recompiling GCC, and therefore we ended up doing a bit of experiment and figuring out that we can actually build CC1 and save a lot of time. But we won't have to build CC1 also for today's exercise. So but still we need to understand what static plugins are. So let's look at the static plugins. And as I said, the static plugins are of the 4 kind in GCC. Translator in the GCC driver, a front end in CC1, passes in CC1, and a backend in CC1. In each case, the implementation mechanism is in terms of a data structure, which has to be initialized in some ways. In the case of a translator for GCC, it's an array of C structures, and we will see what it means. In case of front end, it's a C structure which gets included in a linked list. Passes also, we have a linked list of structures, and for backend we have an array of structures, and we want to look at this array of structures in gory details tomorrow. Today we want to look at this linked list of structures. For front ends and translator, we will not spend too much of time. We will merely see examples of the data structures. Okay. So here the plugin data structure in the GCC driver. When I have to include a new compiler, they use the term compiler in a generic sense. They use the term compiler at an abstract level. Okay, so as far as this terminology is concerned, a linker is also a compiler. Okay, so it's just a translator. So we specify this structure whenever we have to include a new compiler. What we have to do is we have to specify a suffix of the input file. So if you have a compiler that, for example, we have an assembler that's supposed to read in files ending with .s. So we specify the suffix. Okay? Use this compiler for input files whose names end in this particular suffix. In order to use this compiler, run this particular spec is the name of the executable. We specify the name of the executable. And then there are some other details about whether it requires C preprocessor, etc., etc., etc. Okay, but the primary things are these 2 things. Okay, and some of these details are specified in a very arcane way, in a very ununderstandable way, as we shall see just now. The whole point is, when we want to include a new translator in GCC, what we need to do is to instantiate this particular structure, an instance of this particular structure. So default specifications. So there is an array called default compilers. for everything there is this static construct compiler. So struct compiler is what we saw just now. This is a struct compiler, and so each instance, each inner pair of braces is an instance of that particular structure. Okay, and there are default compilers. So .cc files extending with .cc are to be executed by C++. Files extending files with extension .cpp also have to be executed by the same thing. .c has to be executed by C compiler. Okay, so @ means here it's an alias entry. So everything has been specified at the level of string, character string. Okay, and we have essentially a program that's going to read this string of characters, and then the program will decide what exactly needs to be done with it. Okay, hash means the default specs are not available in the top level directory. Maybe there is some other directory that will provide these details. So let's look at complete entry for C in GCC. Okay, so this is aliased to @C, and this is the entry @C. Okay, and then you can see this is a very difficult to read details. There are quite a few details. I have not bothered to look at each and every character there, what it means. But I know that if I need to look at it, I will be able to figure it out. Maybe I'll need half an hour, maybe I'll need half a day, maybe I'll need half a month, but at least I know where to look for. Okay. The purpose, as I emphasized yesterday, the purpose of this workshop is not to give you all information, but to show you how to figure out things, where to look for things. So we'll stop at this, because if you ask me what is the meaning of the 5th line, I will have to say I don't know. Now you will ask me what is the meaning of the 6th line, I will have to say I don't know about 6th line as well. So which means that I know nothing about what is being said here, but I can figure it out, and you should also be able to figure it out. Well, it's most important to look at the examples. Here is plugin data structure for C++. So all these are executed by C++, and this data structure is included in CP lang specs. So for in the top level directory, here we do not have anything for C++, which means that the compiler has to look at some other directory, and we have to specify what that directory is, and this will get compiled in. So all the specifications are in CP, and there's this file langspecs.h, and so all these files, all these 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all these files, all these 7 extensions, files with these 7 extensions will be processed by the same entry. So if you want to impress your friend saying I have included a new kind of file in GCC, I have supported a new file extension for C++ and include your name, all that you need to do is to make an entry here, just change the character string, and that's it, and recompile GCC, and then you are able to accept files with new extensions. So it's really that easy to include some simple functionalities.
This structure type is of the same thing, right?
Yes. Yes.
So this is an extension of that
yes.
default compilers.
Yes. So these are default compilers, and these are language specific compilers.
So no, the structure is still the same.
Structure is still the same. Structure is still the same. And here is a complete C++ header. Okay, I mean there are other details, which one can figure out what the details are. Again, so this is how to process C++ headers. This is how to process C++. Plugin data structure for LTO. We're going to talk about link time optimization. LTO is a separate executable. Okay? That's also a plugin. So it's been implemented in such a way that it doesn't change most of the things in GCC. In fact, the way LTO has been engineered, it's a very interesting software engineering exercise. It's a very interesting exercise in program development. There are some things that are not very good at it. In fact, there are things that are very bad with it, but there are things that are very good with it as well. It's a good learning exercise for us to see how it has been engineered. So this plugin for LTO, Okay, executable is LTO1, and we will have reasons to talk about this LTO1 for a long time. Okay, so that is the plugin for the translators. What about the files to be processed by linker? We didn't find any entry for a linker here. Can someone guess why? No, it includes assemblers and everything. The answer is linking is always the last step in compiling. So once everything is done, whatever remains is passed to linker. So if you can't find an extension that can be processed by anything, GCC will try to pass it on to the linker by default. So that you don't need a separate extension for a linker file. It's anyway the last phase. So let's look at a plugin structure in CC1. So we looked at GCC, the driver. We will look at the code later. Okay, we'll look at the control flow of GCC later. We'll look at the control flow of CC1 later. But we are only looking at the moment how can we include different modules in these. So CC1 has a function called top level main. Top level. That's a top level file. So the main function of CC1 is in toplev.c. So when you use cscope or something else and try to find main functions in GCC, the main function that exists in toplev.c is a main function of CC1. The main function that exists in gcc.c is the main function of the GCC driver. So you have a top level main which is going to call a front end, and we're just looking at a schematic. And the front end is going to call a pass manager. We're going to use this convention. Double arrows represent control flow, and here we have boxes that represent modules and not necessarily executables, because now we are getting into the inside of a code, piece of code. So we have a pass manager. This double arrow indicates control flow, and a single arrow indicates a function pointer. Pointer or index, not necessarily function pointer, pointer to the next instance. So this means that this arrow means that control will be transferred. So top level main will call front end will call a pass manager will call pass1, and pass1 would have an index to the next pass, pointer to the next pass. So there will be a routine called execute pass list, which will take this data structure, will execute this pass, then pick up the next pass, and will execute the whole thing. That's the usual arrangement. Okay. So we have in turn this pass list. Each is an instance of a structure. This in turn has a function pointer for the code. So when we write code for pass1, this code, the entry level function will not be called from anywhere. It will be, so if you try to look for callers of this function, you will see scope will say there is no caller for this function. So you might think that this, why have someone written a function like this if the function is not called from anywhere? But the answer is the function is not called directly, the function is called using a function pointer. And the function pointer has been set up here. So what's the mechanism? Let me repeat. The mechanism is the pass manager is nothing but a simple while loop, which says while pass is not equal to null, or whatever p dot pass is not, p arrow pass is not equal to null, execute the function indicated by the function pointer, and p is equal to p arrow next. That is it. It's a 4-line function, and you can see that, look it up in the GCC. So that is the pass manager. Of course, I'm oversimplifying. There are 4 or 5 different execute functions because we have 4 or 5 different pass lists. But overall, the idea is as simple as that. Okay, so that is how passes are executed.
Sir? Yeah. So the structure that you showed indicates that the passes are compiled statically.
Yes.
So the thing is, when I compile using -O1 and -O2,
yes,
the passes change, the control flow changes. So here the next pointer,
yes,
has been statically, defined in the .c file.
yes,
But -O1 and -O2 would, let's say after pass 2, in -O1 we have pass 3, and in -O3 I have pass 5.
Yes.
So how is that done?
Would someone like to guess? So let me repeat his question. I don't know if all of you are able to hear. His point is, we have shown here these pointers as pointer to the next pass, and we observed yesterday that we can give -O0, -O1, -O2, and based on the option that we give, some passes may be omitted, some passes may be excluded. Now his question is, if we have fixed this list like this, how is that omission, how is that exclusion or inclusion decided based on a command line switch? Because he's saying you already compiled the program, you already compiled the GCC source. Would anyone like to hazard a guess?